one of my favorite songs that we sing. It's one of those old one but good ones. And when Eric plugged it in this week for us to sing, I was overly excited. Because there's something about that repetition, right? That song that says, "Your praise will ever be on my lips." And when we sing as a community together and we proclaim that God is worth praising and that it is worth coming to this space every single week and singing those words together and repeatedly singing those words together, I think it opens our hearts to gratitude. I think it opens our hearts to God's grace more fully and God's love more fully. As JB mentioned earlier, here in Access, we believe that we all have access to God's grace. And I don't know about y'all, but I think that means we worship a really good God, a God that is worth praising, a God that is worth worshiping, not just when we have time, but by making time. And so thank you for being in worship today. Thank you for coming into this space and sharing and singing with us to a God who's so worthy of our praise. Well, my name is Julie Richter, and I am the Access pastor here, and it is good to be with you this morning. We have come into the summer. We're in the middle of June, and so it's time for us to talk about something. It's time for us to talk about this thing that happens every summer that is just part of being here in the summer in Texas. We need to talk about bugs. Because, y'all, I'm already done with the bugs. And they're everywhere in Texas. And I don't think the mosquitoes have been that bad this year until I went outside the other day and was like, oh, maybe I just haven't been outside a whole lot. Our senior high youth got back from their mission trip this last week, so I'm about to throw them under the bus, sorry. They had a little bit of a lice outbreak on the trip. Yeah! But I think they're all good now. I saw several of them yesterday, and they were like, I got checked, I'm good. I got checked, I'm good. I'm like, y'all, I cannot deal with lice right now. So if there is any question about the checking, let's figure this out. So we're talking about bugs today because actually our scripture talks about bugs today. We've been in this story about Moses and the Israelites, and it's a story about Moses, but it's also a story about God's people, the Israelites. The first week we talked about leadership, and we talked about how Moses was called into leadership, but not to be the kind of leader that he thought he should be, but to be the kind of leader that God wanted him to be. And then last week, we talked about shepherding and evangelism. And we talked about Moses calling the people out of Egypt. And we talked about how we thought it was one thing to convince Pharaoh to let the Israelites go out of Egypt, but it was a whole other thing to let the Egyptians or the Israelites be convinced to actually go, that things could actually be better for them. And so Moses' job was to lovingly care for the people, but with confidence and strength, lead them out of slavery. And so we talked about the parting of the Red Sea and what it would be like to have faith. So as we have talked about spiritual gifts the last couple of weeks, we've talked about the intersection of a couple of different things. We've talked about leadership being the intersection of what you are passionate about with what God is calling you to with your gifts. So intersecting your gifts, the gifts that God has given you, with what God has called you to be passionate about. And then last week we talked about evangelism, about sharing the good news of Jesus Christ, and about that looking like telling your story. But your story involves both your head and your heart. And so we talked about the intersection of what has convinced your mind to follow Jesus, as well as what has convinced and compelled your heart to follow Jesus. And it's maybe at that intersection that you might find your testimony. And this morning, we're going to talk about miracles. We're going to talk about faith and miracles and healing. And you might think to yourself, okay, this is going to be a really long sermon because that's three very different things, but they're actually not. Faith is connected to miracles. Miracles are connected to healing, and healing is connected to faith. And there's a story in the scripture that we're going to read today about Moses and the Israelites that connects all three of them. And yes, it's a story about bugs. So let's read that story this morning. It comes from Exodus 16. So the Israelites have gone through and are now in the wilderness. They have escaped Egypt. They are no longer in slavery, but they are in the middle of nowhere. They've been traveling a lot. They really don't have a place to call home. And they're beginning to get hungry and cranky. Kind of like the third day of Vacation Bible Camp. Hungry and cranky. Our leaders told us that Wednesday is always the hardest because the adults are tired and the children are comfortable. So when I envision this scene here with the Israelites, I envision day 3 of Vacation Bible Camp. So let's read this. In Exodus 16, it says, "The whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, 'If we had only died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread, for you have brought us out into the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger.' Then the Lord said to Moses, 'I'm going to rain bread from heaven for you. And each day the people shall go out and gather enough for that day. And in that way I will test them whether they will follow my instruction or not.'" So here's where we get a test of faith. Faith being about not what you say you believe, but doing what God has called you to do. And what God calls the Israelites to do is to go out every single day so that they might be tested. To go out every day and gather. Now, we don't quite know what they're gathering yet. And here in verse 13, we find out. It says, "In the evening, quails came up and covered the camp. And in the morning, there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a fine, flaky substance, as fine as frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, 'What is it?' For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, 'It is the bread that the Lord has given to you to eat.'" And then in verse 31 it says, "The house of Israel called it manna. It was like coriander seed, white, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey." So what we see here is this miracle of manna. But the miracle is not possible first without faith. God tells the people to go and do something rather than just complaining. And if they go and do something, if they go and have faith, if they go and gather where God has called them to gather, then something might actually happen. Now, this miracle here is a little bit interesting. Let's talk about what manna is. There's a group off of the Sinai Peninsula that actually still makes manna. And what happens is that there is tree lice. Yeah, we're going to talk about lice again. Tree lice that goes, and they go to these trees, and they gather all of the minerals from these trees, and then they excrete, this yellowish substance that then flows down these trees. So it's like bug juice. And this bug juice is filled with carbs and sugar. Now, if it stays there too long, it'll flake off the tree or ants will come and eat it. And so the people have to go out every day to these trees to get it off of the trees because otherwise it won't be there. Similar to how the Israelites were called to go and gather every single day. So in order for this miracle to happen, the people had to go do something, and they weren't called to do something once. They were called to do something daily. Every single day, with expectation to go and gather. But I find it interesting that the miracle here is bug juice. That the bread that God gives them, the bread of heaven, comes from lice, bugs on trees. And it makes me wonder a little bit about miracles. And I wonder today if it's important for us to distinguish between faith and superstition and miracles and magic. Barbara Brown Taylor has written a little bit about this manna from heaven, and I want to read to you what she says in her book. She says some believers reject this explanation because they think it takes away from the miracle of manna, but I wonder about that. Does manna have to come out of nowhere in order to qualify as a miracle? Or is the miracle that God heard the complaining of hungry people and fed them with bug juice, with food it would have never occurred for them to eat? Or put it another way, what makes something bread from heaven? Is it the thing itself, or is it the one who sends it? How you answer those questions has a lot to do with how you sense God's presence in your life. If your manna has to drop straight out of heaven looking like a perfect loaf of butter-crusted bread, then chances are you're going to go hungry a lot. When you do not get the miracle you are praying for, you are going to think that God is ignoring you or punishing you, or worse yet, that God is not there. You're going to start comparing yourself to other people and wondering why they seem to have more than you do. Or you may start complaining to heaven about that. Meanwhile, you are going to miss a lot of the other things God is doing for you because they are too ordinary, like bug juice. Too transitory, like manna, that fine, flaky substance that melted as soon as the sun got hot. If, on the other hand, you are willing to look at everything that comes to you as coming from God, then there will be no end to manna in your life. I am on manna alert, and I know that is about more than food. So are miracles today for you more about magic? More about standing back and watching something that God may be doing or not doing? Or is it about participating? In worship, when you come into this space, what we hope that you experience is something that is not a spectator sport. When you come into this place for worship, what we hope that you will experience is not something that you anticipate, but instead something that you fully participate in. Because it is there. Not in spectating, not in assuming that something might be happening or not, but you're just here. But it is in participating that we experience God's presence. So I wonder today if miracles and having faith in those miracles is about seeing God in everything. Seeing God in the ordinary. Seeing God in people that we don't know, seeing God in people that we do know, seeing God not just in the walls of the church, but outside of the walls of the church. The spiritual gift of miracles is about being present to God's presence. And not only being present to God's presence, but naming it. Naming it for other people who don't see it. Naming it for other people who can't quite experience it. Seeing God at work in all things. Being grateful for God at work in the midst of all things. We're called to be stewards. We're called to be stewards of God's creation, and I wonder what that means is actually being aware of what God has already created. Water, creation, animals, children. Our children's minister, Cheryl Bishop, says it a little bit like this: if you don't experience God's presence, go talk to a child. Because maybe it's because they are not as guarded, maybe because they have more freedom with imagination, maybe it is because they feel energy and joy in ways that we are sometimes scarred by. But if you go ask a child, can tell you, they probably can tell you where God is present, where God is at work, where God is moving, and what miracles, ordinary and not, that are happening around you. We see miracles every spring when new life forms. We see miracles every day, but the question for us is, are we present to it? And the question for each of us individually is, do we have the spiritual gift to be incredible enough to call others to that awareness, to call others to be present to what God is doing and God's presence in their lives? So alongside of miracles and faith, we have healing. But similar to faith and miracles, faith is not superstition, miracles is not magic, and healing is also not magic. Healing is about wholeness, I want to read to you what it says in the United Methodist website about what the spiritual gift of healing is. It says the gift of healing is not about transferring spiritual power to eliminate suffering and disease, but the ability to channel God's grace and healing love to those who suffer physical, emotional, and spiritual pain. Healers are moved to be present with those who suffer. Healers pray for those who suffer, visit those who are ill, and are usually moved to extend a hand of comfort and touch to those who are afflicted. When I think about the spiritual gift of healing, the people that I think of are our Stephen ministers. Stephen Ministry is a ministry here in our church where those who are lay leaders in our congregations, just like the rest of us, go through this in-depth training to learn how to care for people, to learn how to walk alongside people, whether they are struggling with a physical illness, whether they are struggling with an emotional illness, whether they are struggling financially, to walk alongside people and regardless of their circumstances, care for them, love them, tell them that they are children of God. Recognize their worth in the same way that their Creator recognizes their worth, so that they may see that their capacity for healing is a capacity for wholeness, is a capacity for living, not by how many days we have left, but by living in a fullness of life each and every day. This week, I had the privilege of going and seeing a documentary about Mr. Rogers called Won't You Be My Neighbor? And it was so, so good. I encourage you to go see it because often what I found myself hearing as they talked about Fred Rogers was a lot of what we talk about in here. That you are loved by God, and that there is not anything that you have to do to deserve that. That was a lot of Mr. Rogers' message to children over decades and decades of ministry. One of the things Mr. Rogers said is that we are creation rebuilders. And I think that speaks a lot to healing. To be not creation builders, our Creator has already done that, but to be creation rebuilders. Rebuilding in our relationships, rebuilding in our community, rebuilding in our world. I want to read to you what he says. He says, we live in a world in which we need to share responsibility. It's easy to say, it's not my child, it's not my community, not my world, not my problem. Then there are those who see the need and respond. I consider those people my heroes. What does it look like for you to be incredible this week and next week and the week after that? To be rebuilders, to care for people. Mr. Rogers always used to say to children, you are so special. And some people began to have issue with that later in his career, that we had maybe created a generation that was entitled and that maybe that was Mr. Rogers' fault. But what Mr. Rogers talks about is that there is nothing a child has to do to deserve love. There is nothing a child has to do to know that they are worth something, that they are worthy of love. I believe each and every one of us could have the spiritual gift of healing if with someone in our lives, we shared that with them. That we told them that they are loved, that we told them that there is a God that loves them. Not a God that judges them or condemns them, but a God that loves them. So if you want to see faith, if you want to see miracles, if you want to see healing, I want to introduce you to our Vacation Bible Camp kids. This past week, I had the privilege of spending the entire week with them as a first grade crew leader. Now, I had said to y'all several months ago, we need Vacation Bible Camp volunteers. We need y'all. There's kids on the waiting list. And so I felt like it was important for me to put my money where my mouth was. So I was with them every day this week. And friends, I have to tell you, our kids bring us joy that is overflowing. Our kids bring us love that is overflowing. I saw such a great amount of faith. Such a great amount of miracles about God being present in the ordinary as our children learned all throughout the week about acceptance and love and joy and peace. I saw healing this week. I saw relationships, new relationships form. I felt my own heart and soul open up. And maybe healing that I needed to experience in my own life this week opened up as I loved on children and got to tell them that they are special and loved by God. And in those words from my mouth, heard them for myself as well. We're going to go into a time of offering. And I want you to see some pictures of the kids that were part of Vacation Bible Camp this week. They're going to come in after that, and they're going to sing a song for you, my favorite song of the week, called God's Love is Overflowing. And as you hear it come out of the words of our children's mouths, may you believe it in your own life that God's love is overflowing. And so we are called to overflow with faith, with belief in miracles, to be present to God's presence, to have faith and miracles and healing be part of our everyday lives. Our children truly are incredible. Let's take a look. Here